Hi, I'm going to be talking about the Great Depression today. In fact, out of all the chapters in the AP textbook, this might be the most important. There's always something on the AP exam about the Great Depression, whether it's several multiple choice questions, and quite oftentimes you might also see an essay, whether it's a DBQ or a different one, but you're at least guaranteed to see some multiple choice questions from the Great Depression era, whether it's the causes of the Great Depression, how FDR handles it with the New Deal, or just any other type of stuff going on with that time period. So it's very, very important to read that chapter of the book carefully and know that material well. So we're going to look at the causes of the Great Depression. There are many different causes. I've picked a few here that are oftentimes attributed. And one thing to understand is many historians debate and dispute things. And in some of these potential causes up here, some historians would dismiss as not as important or not as big of a factor. Well, there are some up here that some historians would also like to include, but these are some of the more common ones that I put up here. And I'm hitting most of the big ones here. One thing is some people say, there's a widening income inequality. And so during this time, the rich have more and more and more wealth. That's something that Huey Long had talked about in when he talks about share our wealth, every man a king. That's one of the reasons why he wants to limit the amount of money you can make in a year and limit the amount of total wealth you can have, because he feels that, as well as many other people do, they feel that when the rich have so much money, they oftentimes sit on it, and that gives less money to the middle class and the lower income people, and therefore there's less money to be spent in consumer products, less money to be spent and help businesses out. And so there's this idea that the widening income inequality back at that time was playing a part in feeding and fueling the Great Depression. Now some people dismiss that offhand, but there very well is some evidence to suggest that a lot of people didn't have the money to be spending. If a lot of people don't have money to be spending, you can understand why businesses would struggle, as less stuff would be getting sold. A second thing is overproduction of industry. The 1920s was a boom time. Calvin Coolidge era was known for being a great economic time. But at the same time, you do see this overproduction, and you do see some cracks in the economies forming in the early 20s before the Great Depression sets hold. And companies were producing more than they could sell, and more than we could sell to the rest of the world. And so this inventory starts to pile up, and as inventory starts to pile up, the factory owners and managers, naturally, they have to find ways to sell this. And they might have to sell it cheaper. If they can't, they might have to reduce working hours or lay off workers because they have more product and inventory piling up than they can sell to the public and sell to the world. So once you start laying off workers because you've overproduced as a factory, and if enough factories are doing this, then the consumers out there, the workers, they have less money in their pockets and can't produce as much. So it starts to become a cycle where the overproduction causes a reduction in hours worked by people. Reduction in hours worked creates less income for the working class. Less income for the working class means that people can't buy as much, which means factories have to lay off. So you start to see a little bit of a vicious cycle kind of feed back and forth into itself. A third option that a lot of people say, and it's really probably a combination of all of these, but a third thing you often hear is the stock market collapse. October 28, 1929, the stock market tanks almost 13%. The next day, it tanks about 12% almost. So you see this drop. This large, sizable drop in 2 days, and it continues to drop. The stock market actually takes a couple decades to fully recover. Some stocks recovered quicker than others, but as a whole, the indexes, some of them didn't really fully recover until the 1950s. But the stock market collapses, and one of the main problems why this causes problems is that some people were buying on margin, meaning that you didn't have the full money when you bought the stock. you could buy stocks on margin with as little as 10% down. So if you're buying $10,000 worth of stock, you could pay $1,000 of your own money and borrow the 90% rest of it, the other $9,000. And if your stock that you bought dropped in half, so you bought $10,000 of stock, you have a $9,000 loan because you bought it on margin, only paying 10% down, your stock falls in half, now it's only worth $5,000, but you still have a $9,000 loan to pay back. And if this stock doesn't recover for decades, potentially, to its full amount, you can see how this could really, really hurt people, especially people buying on margin. Now, some people dismiss this as a major cause of the Great Depression by saying it's estimated about 1 to 2% of the public actually owned public stocks at the time. And if that's the case, they say, well, it didn't affect that amount of people, and the people it did affect the most would be the rich and the well-to-do for the most part. However, some people counter that by saying, well, a lot of businesses own stock and other things, and they were hurt by it. And if businesses get hurt, then obviously, naturally, their workers and therefore the public at large will get hurt if enough of them are getting hurt by the stock market collapse. Bank failures. A lot of banks were doing very, very, very poor policies. Some of them, in fact, had actually even bought stocks with their money. Remember, when you put money into the stock market, the bank just doesn't put it into a vault and lock it. The bank takes that money and puts it out into the public through home mortgage loans, student loans, car loans, loans for starting a business. So when a lot of people need loans for whatever reason, they go to a bank and get the loan. The bank gets the money from your savings account. Oftentimes about 90% or more of the stock's money that they get, they put back out into the community in forms of loans. And some of the stocks were actually bought by banks, and that's a very risky policy that the banks really shouldn't have been doing. And when the stock market tanks, the banks are in a loss because, if I buy a home and I can't pay back the loan to the bank can repossess my house. So the bank's not totally at a loss because in theory I would have been making payments for at least a while before I ran out of money and couldn't pay it anymore. And the bank, so they had some cash back for me, and then they repossessed my home. Well, what do you do if you buy a stock in your bank and it collapses? How are you getting that money back, especially if you need it right away? And banks have been making other risky decisions and investments that they really shouldn't have been. And word gets out on some of the banks, there's runs on banks, there's a panic that ensues. People panic, they go to the bank, and because the bank gives out most of the money in forms of loans to the community, even if the bank's doing proper practices, it isn't doing anything wrong necessarily with its investments, it can't give out all of its money if there's a panic and a run on the bank. This is why President FDR has to have the banking holiday. He shuts down all the banks nationwide, and then he slowly reopens them after his investigators, go in and make sure they're doing proper business practices. Another thing FDR helps do to help calm and ease the fears is he has the Fireside Chats. His first one, for example, is actually about the banking crisis, given shortly after he's inaugurated in as president. Another thing that FDR does to help kind of alleviate this problem is that President Roosevelt, he creates the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and it guarantees people's money in FDIC insured banks up to a certain amount. I think it's like $100,000 today, which is oftentimes why you see rich people spread their money to different banks and spread their money to even different countries to get a variety of assurances. But like today, if I had $1 million in a bank, in the bank collapsed, if it was FDIC insured bank, the bank would at least guarantee me up to $100,000 that the federal government would pay me back because they had insured the bank as having good business practices. And so people could feel relatively safe again about putting money in the bank. And most people aren't going to be putting in over that amount anyways. But these bank failures caused a massive panic. People running on the bank, hearing rumors. Oftentimes it's just panic, irrational fear oftentimes. People running to good banks and demanding their money out. And if enough people do it, and it really doesn't take that big of a percentage it really takes a small percentage to do it, the bank could run out of money and they can't give out the money because it's given out in the forms of loans, the bank failures. So this is one thing that helped cause the Great Depression. And if the banks fail, there aren't institutions around necessarily to give out loans for buying homes, loans for starting businesses, loans for that. So it hurts the community in a variety of ways too. And don't forget too, like especially a lot of farmers. I mean, farmers are oftentimes have lots of loans through banks. I mean, to buy big agricultural equipment and machinery and things like that. Now, poor President Hoover, the Depression would have happened regardless whether he was president or not. I mean, the overproduction, the widening income inequality, the overvalued stock market. The stock market had been booming in the 20s and then suddenly collapsed. These things would have existed whether Hoover was president or not. Remember, he wins the presidency in 1928, which means he becomes president in March of 1929. And you see the stock market collapse in October of that same year. You know, he really didn't cause these things, but he does make decisions that makes the Depression even worse. And so these last couple ones, or these two ones right here, they're not necessarily causes of the Depression, they're causes of why the Depression was as great and as painful as it was. For example, President Hoover looks and he says, well, we have a lot of overproduction. We want to sell more American goods. We're going to place a tariff on goods coming in from Europe. Europe was kind of like our China in some ways of the day back then. We bought a lot of cheap goods from China, and so we have that tariff, a tax on imported goods, goods coming from another country into America. And so he figured, we'll put the Smoot-Hawley tariff in place, a very high tax, so Americans will eat up the inventory of the overproduction from the 1920s. But the problem is Europe reciprocates. They don't want to have their products taxed in America more. And so likewise, they reciprocate and tax our imports into Europe more. And so this, at a time where you would want more trade and world trade and global trade, Hoover's actions of this higher tariff, this much higher tariff, helps to grind trade down and slow it down, which hurts the economy. Another thing that Hoover makes a mistake of is he takes money out of circulation. He takes money out of circulation, and today they try to pump money into circulation when you're in hard economic times. You might have noticed the past few years we've done quantitative easing, where we had been for over a year in length creating $85 billion a month to try to help stimulate the economy, help keep the economy going. Hoover does the exact opposite. He takes money out of circulation. There's less money flowing. There's less money that farmers, have. Remember, you look back at William Jennings Bryan, and William Jennings Bryan, he actually welcomed the idea of the silver, welcomed the idea of inflation as a way to. He thought it would help alleviate some of the farmers' plight and some of the farmers' debt, and that kind of backfired. But taking the money out of the circulation in the 1930s, though, I mean, you want that money in there, and you want that money flowing. And yes, creating more money can cause inflation, but the bigger problem is taking the money out, it just ground the economy to a halt, almost into a catatonic state, where nobody was buying things, people didn't have money, things were going awry. And the last one here is overproduction of farms in the Dust Bowl. One of the great tragedies of the Great Depression is that we had this huge ecological disaster, arguably the worst ecological disaster our country has ever had, at the same time the Great Depression is going on. Farmers had been over-farming, and one of the main reasons why farmers were over-farming was because crop prices had dropped. And so a lot of farmers naturally said, well, to make up for crop prices falling, I'll just farm more, and that way I can make the same amount of money. And a lot of farmers were thinking this, so they had more production of farm goods. And because you had more production of farm goods, higher supply, prices dropped. And it started to feed into itself. And at the same time you're overproducing, you're not letting the land recuperate. And we don't have the same kind of fertilizers and understanding of farming back then like we do today. And so they eat up a lot of the nutrients of the soil from this over farming. We have a massive drought, and you get the Dust Bowl. And this is the worst struck areas of the Dust Bowl. They call it even a dead zone. Is in places like northwest Texas, part of Oklahoma, western Kansas, southeastern Colorado, and it's a dead zone. But the Dust Bowl. Hurt areas, not as hurt as that dead zone, but hurt areas stretch all the way up to Montana and even into North Dakota. And this Dust Bowl even sends dust all the way to Michigan at times. You can see it. Even goes all the way to New York City once. And it's a major ecological disaster. About a third of the people in the dead zone actually pick up stakes and move out to California. And so these are some of the main causes of the Great Depression. It's very important to know them, and it's very important to know how FDR handles the Great Depression with his New Deal and his New Deal programs. Thank you.